On April 17, 2026, Dennis Rodman walked onto another Hall of Fame stage. He was weeks away from his 65th birthday, and more than a quarter century had passed since his final NBA game. This honor did not come from basketball. Kevin Nash and Sean Waltman welcomed him into the celebrity wing of the WWE Hall of Fame, recognizing the nights when Rodman crossed from the Chicago Bulls into professional wrestling and became Rodzilla beside the New World Order. The audience saw the familiar figure. Dark glasses, jewelry, defiant posture. The man who had spent 30 years refusing to enter a room quietly. Rodman honored Hulk Hogan, embraced the old NWO identity, and received applause again for being one of the most unpredictable athletes America had ever watched. But the moment carried a question no championship film had fully answered. What happens when the character survives longer than the career? For most retired stars, the uniform eventually becomes a memory. Rodman faced something more complicated. The basketball player stopped in 2000, but the worm remained in demand. Nightclubs wanted him. Television producers wanted him. Wrestling promoters wanted him. Photographers wanted the colored hair, the piercings, the provocation, and the possibility that something might go wrong. The public expected a spectacle, and spectacle became one of the few jobs that never asked him to retire. That is where the later Dennis Rodman story truly begins. Older fans remember the athlete who seemed to appear wherever the ball was falling. He won 5 NBA championships, led the league in rebounding for 7 straight seasons, and earned 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards. At 6'7", he controlled spaces usually owned by larger men. He studied shooters, angles, rotation, and timing until rebounding became prediction. The Basketball Hall of Fame enshrined him in 2011, and the NBA later selected him for its 75th anniversary team. Basketball also gave Rodman something less visible. It gave him a clock. There was practice in the morning, a flight in the afternoon, film study, training, a game at night. Coaches such as Chuck Daly and Phil Jackson understood that Rodman needed freedom, but they also gave that freedom boundaries. He could disappear into the city, change his appearance, challenge nearly every convention in professional sports, and still know where he had to be when the ball went up. Then the schedule ended. After brief stops with the Los Angeles Lakers and Dallas Mavericks, Rodman's NBA career closed following the 1999-2000 season. The arenas did not vanish immediately. Fame kept opening doors. But the routine that had organized his energy was gone. Years later, Rodman described that period as aimless. Club appearances could pay enormous sums, yet the money left quickly, and the nights became a substitute for competition. He told GQ that Las Vegas sportsbooks had once taken bets on the year he might die. He also recalled Phil Jackson pulling him aside and saying that he did not want him to die. Rodman tried to return. In 2003, he explored a comeback with the Denver Nuggets. That October, a motorcycle crash outside a Las Vegas nightclub injured his leg, and the comeback disappeared. The man who had trained his body to survive 82 games now lived without a season, a final buzzer, or teammates waiting in the locker room. The easy version would blame fame alone. The truth is less convenient. Fame did not create every wound in Dennis Rodman. Many were already there, but fame gave those wounds bright rooms, unlimited invitations, and an audience willing to confuse pain with entertainment. In 2026, wrestling honored the character he had built. The ceremony proved that Rodman had not been forgotten. It also revealed how long he had been carrying the same role. Before the hair, before the wedding dress, before Chicago and the NWO, there had been another Dennis. Quiet, uncertain, nearly invisible. To understand what happened after the applause ended, we have to return to the moment when he first learned that becoming someone else could feel like survival. Long before Dennis Rodman became a symbol of rebellion, he was a young man who could barely imagine being noticed. At 19, he was not preparing for the NBA. He was working nights as a janitor at Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Airport, cleaning spaces used by people who seemed to be going somewhere. Rodman had finished high school without becoming a serious basketball prospect. He was close to 6 feet tall, uncertain about his future, and living without the structure that sports would later provide. Then his body changed. After high school, Rodman grew roughly 7 inches, eventually reaching 6 feet 7. The growth gave him a new physical possibility, but it did not give him confidence overnight. He was inexperienced and far behind players who had spent years inside organized basketball. His route began at Cook County College in Texas, where he played briefly before leaving. The game had noticed his body, but Dennis was still learning whether he belonged. His next opportunity came far from television cameras. At Southeastern Oklahoma State University in Durant, Rodman entered the small world of NAIA basketball. The gyms were modest. The travel was ordinary. There was no national audience waiting to turn him into a celebrity. What he found instead was repetition, responsibility, and people who saw value in him before the rest of the country did. Rodman averaged more than 25 points and nearly 16 rebounds during his 3 seasons there. Those scoring numbers may surprise fans who remember him as a player who rarely searched for his own shot in the NBA. At Southeastern, he had to do more. He ran the floor, attacked the glass, defended several positions, and discovered how much influence one player could have through effort alone. College also gave him something less visible. During those years, Rodman became close to the Rich family in Bochito, Oklahoma. Their home offered a sense of belonging he had struggled to find. James Rich later became one of the men Rodman thanked as a father figure during his Basketball Hall of Fame speech. The relationship mattered because Dennis responded deeply to people who gave him both affection and boundaries. That pattern followed him throughout his career. Rodman was often described as uncontrollable, yet his best years came under leaders who understood that freedom and structure were not opposites. Chuck Daly would provide that balance in Detroit. Phil Jackson would later do the same in Chicago. Before either coach entered his life, the Rich family and Southeastern Oklahoma State showed him that discipline did not always have to feel like rejection. By 1986, NBA scouts were paying attention. At the Portsmouth Invitational Tournament, an event for college seniors, Rodman's energy stood out against players from larger programs. Detroit selected him with the 27th pick in the second round of the NBA draft. He was 25 years old. Most future stars arrive younger, carrying polished resumes and years of expectation. Rodman arrived as a question. Could a player from a small Oklahoma school survive against Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, and the established powers of the league? Could someone who had started so late learn quickly enough to stay? Detroit did not need him to become a conventional star. The Pistons needed speed, defense, toughness, and a player willing to chase possessions other men considered finished. That role suited him because Rodman had spent much of his early life arriving after everyone else. His late beginning became an advantage. He did not enter the NBA believing the game owed him shots, praise, or comfort. He had already worked nights while strangers passed through an airport. He had already watched basketball move ahead without him. Every practice in Detroit carried the knowledge that his invitation could still be taken away. The public would eventually remember the colors and controversies. His teammates first met someone different, shy, emotional, eager to please, and desperate to earn a permanent place. Detroit would give him that place. It would also give him the closest thing he had known to a stable professional family. And when that family began to disappear, Dennis Rodman would start changing in ways no one around him fully understood. Detroit did more than introduce Dennis Rodman to professional basketball. It gave him an identity he could trust. When he joined the Pistons in 1986, Rodman was surrounded by men who already understood their roles. Isaiah Thomas controlled the game. Joe Dumars brought quiet precision. Bill Laimbeer and Rick Mahorn supplied intimidation. Chuck Daly stood above them all, managing strong personalities without asking them to become smaller. Rodman was different then. Teammates remembered a reserved young player who smiled easily, worked constantly, and seemed grateful simply to be included. He did not arrive with brightly colored hair or a carefully constructed public persona. He arrived early, defended whoever Daly assigned him, and treated every loose ball as proof that he deserved to stay. Daly recognized something beneath that effort. Rodman needed more than instruction. He needed reassurance that one poor night would not make him disposable. Their connection grew beyond ordinary coaching. Daly could challenge Rodman without humiliating him. He understood when to demand discipline and when to offer patience. During Rodman's 2011 Hall of Fame speech, He named Daly among 4 men who had supplied the guidance he had been missing. Rodman described the kind of person who could be called at any hour, offering a hand, a shoulder, or honest advice. With that stability around him, Rodman became extraordinary. Detroit won consecutive championships in 1989 and 1990. Rodman developed into the NBA's Defensive Player of the Year in 1990 and again in 1991. He could defend guards on the perimeter, battle forwards near the basket, and wear down scorers through relentless attention. He was not performing a character yet. His energy belonged almost entirely to basketball. Then the family began to separate. Veterans departed. The championship team aged. Daly left the Pistons after the 1991-92 season. For Detroit, it was the natural closing of an era. For Rodman, it felt more personal. The man who had provided order, trust, and something resembling paternal care was suddenly gone. Rodman continued producing remarkable numbers. During the 1991-92 season, he averaged 7 rebounds per game. On March 4, 1992, he collected 34 rebounds against the Indiana Pacers. The statistics suggested complete control. His private life suggested the opposite. By early 1993, Rodman felt increasingly isolated. His marriage to Annie Bakes had broken down, and distance from their young daughter added another loss. The Pistons were no longer the close group he had entered years earlier. He later explained that many of the people he loved were gone and that he felt he had no one to turn to. One night in February 1993, Rodman drove to the parking lot outside the Palace of Auburn Hills. A rifle was inside his truck. He listened to music and remained there for hours, struggling with whether he wanted to continue living. Police eventually found him asleep after someone requested that they check on him. Rodman later said the crisis was not caused by basketball. It came from losing the love and security around it. He survived that night, but he did not emerge unchanged. He withdrew into his home for weeks and began thinking about the version of Dennis Rodman who had spent years trying to please everyone else. He decided that version of himself could no longer continue. In October 1993, Detroit traded him to the San Antonio Spurs. The quiet player who had entered the league 7 years earlier was disappearing. The transformation that followed would be celebrated as freedom, criticized as chaos, and marketed across America. But it began during a period of profound loneliness. Dennis Rodman did not suddenly become outrageous because fame had made life easy. He created a louder identity when the old one no longer seemed strong enough to keep him alive. San Antonio received Dennis Rodman in October 1993, but the man who arrived was no longer the quiet defender Detroit had drafted 7 years earlier. His hair began changing colors. Tattoos became more visible. Piercings followed. He spoke more openly, challenged expectations, and stopped trying to make traditional basketball audiences comfortable. To some fans, it looked like rebellion for attention. To Rodman, it was closer to a declaration. He had spent years living as the person coaches, teammates, and the public expected him to be. Now he wanted control over the image that entered the room before anyone could judge the man underneath it. The transformation did not damage his ability to play. During 2 seasons with the Spurs, Rodman continued dominating the glass. In 1993-94, he averaged more than 17 rebounds per game and won another league rebounding title. San Antonio had David Robinson, one of the finest centers of the era, and enough talent to contend in the Western Conference. On paper, Rodman should have been the final defensive piece. The relationship never became comfortable. Rodman resisted the team's structure. He missed obligations, clashed with management, and sometimes appeared unwilling to fit into the role the organization wanted. During the 1995 playoffs, tension became impossible to hide. The Spurs reached the Western Conference Finals against the Houston Rockets, but Hakeem Olajuwon overwhelmed San Antonio with one of the greatest postseason performances of his career. Rodman's behavior and disagreements with coach Bob Hill became part of the story surrounding the defeat. The problem was not that Rodman had stopped caring about basketball. He cared deeply about the parts of the game he considered honest: effort, defense, positioning, and physical sacrifice. He had become far less willing to accept authority simply because it came from a suit or a title. That attitude made him difficult to manage. It also made him valuable to a team strong enough to absorb him. In October 1995, San Antonio traded Rodman to the Chicago Bulls for center Will Perdue. The move carried enormous risk. Chicago was preparing for Michael Jordan's first full season after returning from baseball. The Bulls wanted another championship, and Rodman's reputation had become as famous as his rebounding. Phil Jackson did not begin by trying to erase that reputation. Jackson understood that Rodman needed clear responsibilities without feeling controlled in every part of his life. Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen had both fought against him during the bitter Detroit years. They did not need to become close friends. They needed to trust that when the game started, Rodman would do the work no one else could do as well. He did. The 1995-96 Bulls won 72 regular season games, then an NBA record. Rodman led the league in rebounding and helped Chicago defeat the Seattle Supersonics in the NBA Finals. The Bulls repeated in 1997 against the Utah Jazz and defeated Utah again in 1998, completing their second three-peat of the decade. Those championships made Rodman globally famous, but they also strengthened the division between the athlete and the public character. The basketball version remained disciplined in ways casual viewers sometimes missed. He studied film, learned how individual shooters missed, and prepared his body for nightly collisions. Teammates could be frustrated by what happened away from the arena and still know that he would attack the glass when the game mattered. The other Rodman belonged to television. He dated Madonna briefly. He wore a wedding dress to promote his 1996 autobiography, Bad as I Wanna Be. He appeared at celebrity events, became a frequent subject of tabloid coverage, and entered professional wrestling while still under contract with the Bulls. In July 1997, he teamed with Hulk Hogan at World Championship Wrestling's Bash at the Beach. 1 year later, during the 1998 NBA Finals, he left Chicago between games to participate in another wrestling event. For the Bulls, those choices created distractions. For promoters, they created enormous attention. For Rodman, the line between personal freedom and professional performance was becoming difficult to locate. He had built a character strong enough to protect him from invisibility. But characters must be fed. Each appearance had to be louder. Each headline had to be stranger. The public no longer waited only for rebounds. It waited to see what Dennis Rodman would do next. Chicago's dynasty ended after the 1998 championship. Phil Jackson departed. Jordan retired again. Pippen was traded. The structure that had contained Rodman's energy disappeared almost overnight. For the second time in his career, a basketball family broke apart around him. This time, however, Rodman was not returning to silence. He was returning to a world that had learned to reward his chaos. The Chicago Bulls released Dennis Rodman in January 1999, ending the most visible chapter of his career. He was 37 years old, still famous enough to fill an arena, and still capable of rebounding against younger bodies. What he no longer had was a team built to understand him. The Los Angeles Lakers offered one more chance. Rodman joined Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant during the shortened 1998-99 season, but the arrangement lasted only 23 games. He could still collect rebounds. The problem was everything around them. He arrived late, missed practices, and struggled to accept a smaller place inside a team that had its own future stars. The Lakers released him before the playoffs. In February 2000, Rodman returned to the city where he had spent part of his childhood, signing with the Dallas Mavericks. The homecoming sounded meaningful. It ended after 12 games. Dallas released him in March, and he never played in the NBA again. His final season closed without a ceremony, a farewell tour, or one last championship moment. NBA.com. For 14 years, basketball had told Rodman where to stand. Without it, every day became open space. He continued playing occasionally outside the NBA, joining teams in Mexico, the American Basketball Association, Finland, and the United Kingdom. Those appearances allowed him to wear a uniform again, but they did not restore the world he had lost. There was no Phil Jackson waiting with a plan, No Michael Jordan expecting him to be ready by tip-off. No 82-game season strong enough to pull his life into order. Celebrity became the replacement schedule. Rodman appeared on reality television, attended paid events, entered exhibition games, and remained a dependable attraction wherever organizers needed attention. Some nights, people came to see a basketball legend. On others, they seemed to be waiting for the unpredictable character they had watched throughout the 1990s. Alcohol increasingly became part of that life. Rodman later spoke openly about his drinking and the way retirement left him without direction. In a 2021 interview, he described collecting large appearance fees in Las Vegas and spending the money almost as quickly as it arrived. He also recalled learning that sportsbooks had once accepted bets on what year he would die. The story sounded outrageous, but it revealed the public role he had inherited. Even his survival had become entertainment. GQ.com. There were attempts to intervene. In 2008, Rodman entered an outpatient rehabilitation program. The following year, he appeared on Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew, where his drinking and resistance to treatment became television material. He later entered a sober living program connected to the show. Recovery, like so much of his adult life, unfolded with cameras nearby. The cycle did not end cleanly. In 2014, Rodman traveled to North Korea with a group of former basketball players for an exhibition organized around Kim Jong-un's birthday. Rodman had already made several controversial visits to the country and described the North Korean leader as a friend. During a live television interview from Pyongyang, he became agitated while answering questions about detained American Kenneth Bay. Rodman later apologized, saying he had been drinking and was under pressure. After returning to the United States, he checked into a rehabilitation facility and publicly discussed his battle with alcohol. CNN.com. The North Korea visits made him a political curiosity. Some saw dangerous naivete. Others wondered whether an unconventional friendship might create an unlikely opening. Rodman insisted that he was not a diplomat, yet the trips placed him in situations far beyond basketball, where instinct and charisma could not provide simple answers. The man who had once mastered a specific role was now being asked to play roles no coach had designed. Entertainer, reality star, international messenger, living symbol of the Chicago Bulls, public example of addiction and survival. Through all of it, Rodman remained recognizable. That recognition sometimes hid how far he had traveled from the young player whose life revolved around practice. He had spent years escaping invisibility. Retirement presented a different challenge, learning whether Dennis Rodman could still exist when no performance was required. By 2011, basketball finally called him home, but when he reached the Hall of Fame stage, the trophies were not what brought him to tears. When Dennis Rodman entered the Basketball Hall of Fame in 2011, he did not use the stage to recite statistics. He spoke about regret. Wearing a jacket bearing the names of the teams that had shaped him, Rodman thanked Chuck Daly, Phil Jackson, Jerry Buss, and James Rich. These were the men who had offered direction when his life needed it most. Then his voice weakened. He admitted that he wished he had been a better husband and a better father. It was one of the rare moments when the character stepped aside. The Hall of Fame recognized what longtime fans already understood. Rodman had changed basketball without becoming a scorer. He won 5 championships, earned 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, and led the NBA in rebounding for 7 consecutive seasons. In 2021, he was selected for the NBA's 75th anniversary team. Yet age brought no simple ending. Rodman remained a public figure, appearing at basketball events, conventions, interviews, and entertainment ceremonies. In April 2026, weeks before turning 65, he entered the celebrity wing of the WWE Hall of Fame. Kevin Nash and Sean Waltman presented him, reconnecting Rodman with the wrestling world that had embraced his Rodzilla persona during the Chicago Bulls years. The honor showed how widely his influence had traveled. It also revealed something more personal. Dennis Rodman had spent decades moving between identities: overlooked child, defensive specialist, champion, cultural rebel, wrestler, celebrity, and survivor. Some chapters remain unresolved. Public apologies cannot restore missed years. Treatment cannot erase every difficult night. Recognition cannot provide the daily structure basketball once gave him. But Rodman is still here. The outrageous clothes no longer shock the way they once did. The colored hair has become part of sports history. What remains most clearly is the player, leaning into a larger opponent, studying the flight of the ball, moving before anyone else understood where it would land. The applause eventually ended. The rebounds did not disappear. They remain in old broadcasts, championship memories, and the lessons passed from one generation of players to another. Dennis Rodman showed that greatness could live in effort, timing, sacrifice, and work that rarely received the final highlight. When you remember Dennis Rodman today, do you first see the spectacle or the extraordinary player underneath it? Subscribe for more human stories about the sports legends we never truly forgot.